Greetings, everyone, from the Comm Theory and Research class. This is Professor Theo, and here is the remaining 2 slides from Chapter 3 that we spoke about last week when it comes to the traditions of communication theory. But just to give a quick recap, we talked about the 7 theories, which were the 7 traditions of theory, which we had the semiotic tradition, we had the phenomenological tradition, we had the cybernetic tradition, we had the social psychological, the social cultural, then we had the critical, and then we had rhetorical. And so now we're going to look specifically at the last 2 traditions that we have not covered. Just remember semiotics being the tradition that focuses on signs and symbols and how they're used in our lives. The phenomenological tradition was the study of the lived experience. And so you want to look at the phenomenon, which is anything. You want to look specifically at it and look directly at it and understand that lived experience on a case-by-case basis. Cybernetic focuses on systems and how the parts of a system influences each other. Social psychological, which dealt with the study of the individual as a social being. So we aren't who we are in isolation, we are who we are within the context of other people. And then social cultural focusing on the ways in which we also interact with each other and not just on the individual's behaviors and attributes. So if I look at a person's behavior, I have to look at that person's behavior within the context of the other factors. Why did they do the way they do? Who did they interact with that caused that behavior? You can't just look at that individual's unique characteristics and behaviors by itself in a vacuum within the context of the social interaction. So it's very similar to the social psychological. The critical condition is number 6. So that's what we're going to look at now. This critical tradition. And you've already learned some stuff about the critical tradition in regards to how it really seeks to understand issues of power, privilege, structure, hierarchy, things of that nature, and not only seek to understand them, but oftentimes the critical condition seeks to be able to bring about change. So it's not simply saying here's what is, but here's the problem with this system and here's how it should change. So it seeks to reveal, understand how power, oppression, and privilege are established and maintained through certain communications traditions. So specifically from a communication standpoint, what this tradition looks at are theories that talk about how communication itself is often used to establish, maintain, and perpetuate unjust systems. The way we speak about things, the language that we use, different things of that nature. So look at those types of theories. And there are 6 variations or 6 areas of study that fall underneath the critical condition. I always say critical condition. The critical tradition. Number 1 being Marxism. And you've probably heard of Marxism in other contexts, and it often gets a negative rap from a standpoint of what it stands for. But within communication tradition and within this particular tradition, Marxism basically talked about how society is often capitalistic and it's driven by the production and the selling of goods. And so there's this industry that takes place where goods are manufactured, things are manufactured, and then there's money or profit to be made from that. And often due to a hierarchical system or hierarchical structure, they're going to be the ones up top who are doing making all the decisions and ultimately making all of the money. But then you have this lower class citizen who is often the labor force. They're the ones who's actually putting their hands to the plow and producing the product. And what happens often is that that particular lower class population will eventually wake up and become fed up of being the population that does all the work, but doesn't get all the benefit, doesn't get all the money. And what Marxism from a communication and critical standpoint would presuppose was that eventually that lower class has to rebel or rise up and begin to question what's being communicated to them, not just in that particular industry, but also in greater society. Normally there's a strategic communication that's going out that is designed to keep them oppressed. Maybe it could be something simple as saying, well, it's just the way things are. If you've ever heard that phrase, it's just the way things are. That's often spoken in a way that would cause someone who's thinking about challenging the system to just accept it for it's just the way things are. So everything that's being communicated to them reminds them, yes, that you may be in this lower place, but you serve a great purpose, and you should just be satisfied with being in that place, because without you, this big machine can't continue to work. And it sounds good because there's someone up top. And so what Marxism from a critical tradition standpoint would challenge is any communication that is created that will continue to subjugate the people. All right? The next variation is called the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt as in Frankfurt, Germany. And this was a school of sociologists, philosophers, economists, anthropologists. All these intellectuals got together and they began to figure out if there was a way to integrate their disciplines of psychology, sociology, history, especially economics, to combine all those to create a theory, a critical theory, that would address holistically some of the ills of society. So instead of just looking at oppression or power and privilege from one perspective, from a psychological standpoint, perspective, or just from a historical perspective, or from an economic perspective, they got together and says, if we're going to truly address this issue, it needs to be addressed holistically. So let's combine the best minds from these different disciplines and fields and say, can we come up with some theories that are more comprehensive, more encompassing, to not just address segments of oppression or segments of privilege or power, but to come up with theories that can look at it from a more holistic standpoint. So that was the Frankfurt School. And what's cool about this particular concept is it's in line with the history of Comm Theory. As I mentioned in class, a lot of communication theories did not originate within the discipline or the field of communication, and actually a lot of them originated in other fields such as psychology, sociology, anthropology, history. And so this is kind of right up that same alley. The next variation is called postmodernism, also called cultural studies. And so you go to a lot of different colleges, you can major in cultural studies. And cultural studies was a break from modernism, and it presented a shift from an industrial society to the information age. So think about at one point in time, maybe with your grandparents, with my parents and grandparents also, but mostly my parents, and later on my grandparents, earlier on at least, we were in this industrial age. You know, everyone had factory jobs. Whether it was in the Midwest, you had a lot of the steel mills, which people still work at today. So a lot of those type of industrial jobs, because you had the Industrial Revolution. Well, this postmodernism reflects a shift in the communication practices that reflect a shift from the industrial age to the information age. So now one of the hottest commodities aren't necessarily steel and coal and things of that nature, even though we still do produce those things, but those aren't the hot commodities that we're producing. Now a lot of the things that we're producing are bigger and better and faster, quicker ways to communicate, to be able to disseminate all this information, because there's more and more information than ever. And people need access to that information and want to be able to transmit information from point A to point B. So postmodernism reflects that shift from the industrial age to this information age. Post-structuralism is number 4. It's the 4th variation. And it seeks a historical approach to understanding the world and people that live in it. And so this is important. Even as a believer, I am very big on history. As we're trying to address certain issues, so take my best friend Ryan and I, as we're often trying to address this issue of racial reconciliation, one of the things we challenge people on, especially those who are engaged in cross-racial relationships, we often want to keep our relationship in the here and now. We want to focus on who we are as brothers and sisters in Christ, or as brothers in Christ, or my best friend is black, my best friend is white. We just want to focus on that relationship as is in the moment. Yet I think it's always important, if you're talking about racial reconciliation, that you can't just look at it, your relationship in the moment within a vacuum with just you and that other person. You have to look at it within this historical context. You have to look at it in light of history that impacts each person differently. And so we can't just say, well, as long as you and I are on the same page and we're striving to move from this present point to the future, we're great, and we're going to ignore anything in the past. That's not going to be very healthy. It's not going to be very, it's not going to allow for a very authentic and accurate building of relationship, because our relationships and who we are is often predicated on who we were and what we've been through. And so that this looks at a historical perspective. Post-structuralism seeks a historical approach to understanding the world. So we can't just look at today's world and look at it within the lens of today's world. We have to look at today's world by thinking about yesterday's world. How does the history of communication impact how we communicate today? How does our historical relationships with one another impact our current relationship? So that's what post-structuralism seeks, to develop a historical approach to understanding how we live our lives. The last 2, you have post-colonial theory. This is a very interesting one. This refers to the studies of all cultures that were affected by imperialism, from colonialism all the way up to today. And what this means is, if you studied history, oftentimes a lot of the countries that exist today that are independent were once under a particular rule. So my wife and I, when we lived in Jamaica, my wife's part Jamaican, we often talked about how Jamaica was under English rule at one time. And in America, we were under British rule, and we got our independence. There are islands that we've, as Americans, as a country, have colonized. There are places all over the world that are colonies of other countries. And what often happens is those who have the strongest military might, the most money, they become the colonizers. And it impacts those who are subjugated under them. And remember, we're talking about critical theory, which talks about power and privilege and structure. So post-colonial theory refers to the study of how cultures that even after they've gotten their independence, there's still some residual effects of being colonized, whether it's a inferiority complex, because you were under someone's rule. Even after you're free, you still don't feel as valued. And so it's like the same thing, maybe in a abusive and unhealthy relationship, and you're under the rule of this abusive person, especially if we're talking about an abusive male or who overpowers a female. Even when she frees herself, as far as breaking up with that person, more than likely there's some damage that's done that allows her not to walk into full manifestation of freedom. Maybe she's insecure now, maybe she's been beat down mentally and emotionally, although she's no longer physically being beat down, that residue is still there. And what this theory seeks to look at is countries and people groups who have once been subjugated, who have once been under the rule of others, how even once they're free, how that power can still reign over them. Maybe some mental bondage, some emotional bondage, some spiritual bondage. And then lastly, you have feminist studies. Maybe some of you are familiar with some feminist studies, but it examines, critiques, and challenges any perceived negative, restrictive, oppressive concepts about masculinity and femininity. And it seeks to examine those things in order that both men and women would have healthy relationships with each other. And so it's not just simply this women's empowerment thing. It's examining gender roles. It examines what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. When we use those terms, you act like a man, or you're acting like a woman. What are we really implying? And it seeks to challenge those type of stereotypes, those notions, those gender roles, those misconceptions about masculinity and femininity, in order that both sides could be the best version of themselves, and ultimately that both sides can work best with each other in healthy relationships. All right? So that would be it for the critical theory. Once again, we have Marxism, we have the Frankfurt School, we have postmodernism, we have post-structuralism, we have post-colonialism theory, and then we have feminist studies. The last tradition we're going to speak about is the rhetorical tradition. So think about rhetoric, this art of persuasive speaking, which is what the rhetorical tradition was originally. That's interesting. One second. Yeah, let's have these mislabeled. Yeah, so originally the rhetorical tradition was concerned with persuasive speaking. So that was it. Now it's actually morphed to include all the way that people use symbols to impact those around them. But it has that same connotation of, if I'm trying to persuade you, if I'm trying to really get you to buy into certain things, as a speaker, part of the 5 canons of rhetoric, the number 1 was invention, which is using everything at your disposal to be persuasive, to craft your message. So as a professor, I think about even shooting this video. Since we got behind in class, this video serves as just another means, another tool to hopefully help you grasp the material. I think of stories that you may tell. I think of anything that you have at your disposal to say, well, here's a message I'm trying to get across. What do I have that I can use? And I'll use whatever it takes to be most effective in getting this message across. That's what rhetoric looks at nowadays. And there are 6 variations of rhetoric. And unlike the other traditions, the variations aren't simply just different schools of thought. The variations within the rhetorical traditions are actually labeled as eras, like a time period. And so there were certain time periods where there was a different emphasis in this rhetorical tradition. And so first we're going to start with the classical era. This was from the 5th to 1st century BC, and it focused on defining and refining what rhetoric was and how it should be used. And that makes sense. It's during this time that they're getting together for the first time. Individuals like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Cicero, who was one who invented the 5 kinds of rhetoric. They're getting together and they're formulating their thoughts on what is rhetoric and how can it be used, how is it judged. So imagine that they have this organic thing that takes place where they're getting together, they're talking, they're debating, they're challenging each other through they're judging their oratorical skills. And then they get together and start to formulate, well, what should we call this thing that we're doing? What's the purpose of it? How do we measure it? How do we judge it? How do we improve it? How do we recreate it? So this is during this classical era that they're defining what rhetoric is, as well as later on redefining. Because since it's new, as they learn more about it and they pick up new things, they're going to redefine what it is. So that's the classical era. Next you have the Middle Ages, and you probably heard of the Middle Ages in other contexts. This is from 400 to 1400 AD. This focused on the rhetorical arrangement and style, especially in terms of letter writing, poetry, preaching, things of that nature. So now it's not simply how do we put together this public discourse, but how do we use rhetoric to better formulate our letters. So to communicate what we're trying to get across in letters, to communicate what we're trying to get across through poetry, to communicate what we're trying to get across through preaching. And so it gives us a glimpse of all the ways in which we can use rhetoric today. So if this was extended today, it would include other forms of writing also. Maybe texting and social media, who knows. Then you have the Renaissance. This was from 1300 to 1600 AD. And whenever you hear that word Renaissance, you think about like a renewal. There was a heyday, a high point of a particular thing, and then sometimes that thing begins to wane or die off, or it loses its popularity. And then a Renaissance is kind of like this resurgence of it, this renewal of it. People get excited about it once again. In a similar fashion, the Renaissance era was marked by the rebirth of rhetoric as a philosophical art. A reminder of this great thing called rhetoric. And I think we need another renaissance of that. We, in today's generation, we need to be reminded of just the value of rhetoric in public discourse and persuasion. And so that was the Renaissance era, marked by a rebirth of rhetoric as a philosophical art. Next, and we're almost done, you had the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment era. In my apologies on the notes, it says that there's 6 variations. It's actually 5 variations of study. So there's 5 eras. So you have the Enlightenment, which is 1600 to 1800 AD. And we don't refer to it as AD after that. Focused on logic and knowledge apart from language and rhetoric. The emphasis was on the objective and absolute truth. So let's break that down. It focused on logic and knowledge apart from language and rhetoric. And so it wasn't just, if you were going to be persuasive, you couldn't just be eloquent. You couldn't just have emotional appeals. So think about pathos if you've studied the persuasive artistic proofs, the 3 meanings of persuasions: pathos, ethos, and logos. You couldn't just have pathos. You couldn't just have this emotional appeal. But you also had to have logical reasoning. You had to appeal to a person's intellect. You had to appeal to what was true, what could be provable. What's cool about this is in the Bible, we often have this misconception about Paul. And when Paul talks about he doesn't speak, when he preaches the gospel of eloquent words, as to not see himself more highly as he ought, things of that nature. Yet throughout the book of Acts, when we read about Paul and his different missionary journeys all around, whether it's in Antioch or Iconium and Lystrum and different places throughout in the Old Testament, we read that he spoke using logic, using persuasive means, using reason and things of that nature. And so even Paul himself was very articulate, very learned. And although it says in those same passages that he was led by the Holy Spirit, it also makes note that he used logic, he used sound reasoning. He appealed to what was provable, what was true. And that was during this Enlightenment age. That was the main focus, to not just be about creative and persuasive speaking, but to also make sure we're speaking in a way that makes logical sense, having sound arguments, using reason. And then the last era is the modern era. That's the 20th and the 21st century. So that encompasses what we're doing right now. During this era, mass media brought more attention to both verbal and visual forms of rhetoric. And so this speaks to this ever-changing. So this is where we're at now. And so when we thought about rhetoric maybe decades ago, we wouldn't have been thinking about how it can include social media and things of that nature. And so I think it's always important that we pay homage to the past and things of that nature, but we also embrace the present and the future. And that's something we can do in this modern era when it comes to rhetoric. All right? So once again, this was the final tradition, the rhetorical tradition. It has 5 variations. I'll make sure I get that changed in the PowerPoint. The classical era, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern era. And then we also talked about number 6, which was that critical condition, and we broke down those traditions. So please, hopefully this video was helpful. We're going to pick this back up on Tuesday, go through a review of both chapters 2 and 3, and we're going to continue to prepare for the exam. Take care and God bless. Once again, it's Professor Theo Williams, and I'm out of here. Peace.